The Kepler frontier was cold and quiet, the way deep space always was. There were no sounds out there, no wind, no movement, just stars sitting far away like old campfires that had almost burned out. Between those stars, the darkness stretched on forever, and in the darkness, 12 human frigates and 4 destroyers moved slowly in a tight formation, keeping watch over a border that humanity had only recently called its own. Commander Dale Mercer stood on the bridge of the UES Ardent, his hands resting on the edge of the navigation console. He was not a tall man, but he carried himself in a way that made people feel steady around him. His face was lined from years of service, his eyes the kind of gray that looked like they had seen too much and decided not to be surprised anymore. He was watching the sensor screen when the alert came in. A Vorkai fleet had just dropped out of faster-than-light travel less than 90,000 km away. 40 warships. Big ones. The crew on the bridge did not panic. They had trained too long for panic. But the air changed, the way air always changes when something serious walks into a room. People sat up straighter. Fingers moved to stations. Eyes went to screens. Dale looked at the numbers on the display. 40 ships. His fleet had 16. The Vorkai vessels were also larger, heavier and better armed in open combat. Any military calculator in the galaxy would say the same thing. This was not a fair fight. He took a slow breath and waited. The Vorkai did not wait long. A transmission came through on the open channel, the kind meant to be heard by everyone in range. The voice that came through the speaker was deep and rough, like gravel being dragged across metal. It was Shrak Vass, the fleet admiral of the Vorkai Collective's frontier division. He was a large creature by any standard. Reptilian, with scales the color of old iron and eyes that had watched many smaller species fold under pressure. His first words were not a warning. They were not a demand. They were something worse. He laughed. It was a long, slow sound, and behind it came the voices of others on his ship. And then, as the transmission spread across the shared military frequencies of the sector, more laughter from more ships. The Dravethi Union had 2 monitoring vessels nearby. The Caliph monarchy had a research station on the far edge of sensor range. All of them received the transmission. All of them listened. Shrakvas spoke between the laughter. He said that he had received reports of a human patrol fleet operating near the frontier border and that he had expected something worth looking at. Instead, he said, his sensors were showing him what looked like a small collection of old knives arranged in a row. He said that he had seen better armed asteroid mining operations. He called the human formation a parade, the kind that children organize in the street with sticks and noise, meaning nothing to anyone watching. Some of his officers could be heard in the background adding their own comments. One said that the human ships looked like they had been built from parts that other species threw away. Another said that the humans must not own mirrors or they would be embarrassed to show up in such condition. Dale listened to all of it. He did not move. He did not raise his voice. Kara Novik, standing at the communication station to his left, looked at him with a question in her eyes. She was young, barely 26, with short brown hair and a way of paying attention that made her very good at her job. She was waiting to see what Dale would do. Dale reached over and opened the return channel. He spoke clearly and without any heat in his voice. He told Shrakvas that the UES Ardent and its accompanying fleet were operating within human territorial boundaries as defined by the Kepler Accords, and that their presence was authorized and routine. He said that his command had already been notified of the Vorkuta contact. He said nothing else. He closed the channel. The response from the Vorkuta side was more laughter, though it was slightly shorter than before. Across the open frequencies, the Dravethian ambassador, a long-limbed creature named Yulprez, sent a quiet note to his government. He wrote that the humans appeared to have no real answer to the Vorkuta challenge, and that the frontier situation would likely resolve itself through human withdrawal within the week. He suggested that his government begin drafting language for territorial renegotiation. The Caliph observers set their instruments to high-resolution recording mode. They expected this encounter to become a useful historical example of what happened when a young species moved too fast, claimed too much, and found itself unable to back it up. On the bridge of the Ardent, Kara leaned slightly toward Dale and spoke in a low voice. She asked him if he wanted her to run updated threat projections on the Vorkuta formation. Dale told her no. She looked at him for a moment. Then she asked if he needed anything else done right now. He said yes. He told her to send a message on the deep encryption channel, the one that did not show up on any shared network, the one that used the old burst coding system that human engineers had developed during the war and never publicly retired. He told her the message should contain 2 words only. She pulled up the channel and looked at him, ready to type. He said the words, "Shepherd, rise." She sent it without asking what it meant. She had been briefed before the deployment, same as every officer on the frontier. She knew what those words were for. She knew what was coming. She just had not known exactly when. After the message was sent, she sat back in her chair and looked at the sensor display showing the 40 Vorkuta warships arranged in a wide formation ahead of them. She thought about the size of those ships. She thought about the weapons they carried. She thought about how long a battle between 2 such unequal forces would actually last. Then she thought about what was somewhere out in the dark behind them, moving quietly, waiting for exactly this kind of moment. She found that she was not afraid. That surprised her a little. Dale walked back to his command seat and sat down. He picked up the cup of coffee that had been sitting on the side console since before the Vorkai arrived. He took a sip. It had already started to go cold. Esrakva sent one more transmission a few minutes later. This time the laughter was gone. He told the human fleet that the Vorkai collective considered their continued presence in the Kepler frontier to be a provocation, and that he was prepared to respond to provocations. He did not name a specific timeline, but the meaning was clear. He was giving the humans a chance to turn around before he decided they needed to be removed. Dale set his coffee down and looked at the sensor screen. The 16 human ships held their position. Not one of them moved a single kilometer toward the Vorkai. Not one of them began a turn. Their engine signatures stayed exactly Where they were common level, as if they 40 warships ahead of them were nothing more than background noise. As Rakva watched his own sensors, he waited for the movement that he expected. The small adjustment in formation. The beginning of a slow reverse. The surrender of space that a smaller, weaker fleet should logically offer when faced with something it could not match. The humans did not move. He told his crew they were either very brave or very stupid, and that in his experience those two things usually looked the same right up until the moment they did not. None of his sensors were looking behind the human fleet. None of them were watching the deep dark, from which 3 hours ago something very large had begun to move. To understand why the Vorkai laughed, it helped to understand how humanity had arrived in the stars in the first place. 40 years ago, a human colony ship called the Marigold was traveling through the Proxima system, carrying 812 people. Families, engineers, teachers, farmers. All of them looking for a new place to build something worth keeping. They were not armed. They were not soldiers. They were people carrying seeds and tools and photographs of places they had left behind. The Vorkai patrol that found them did not ask questions. The Marigold never reached its destination. The wreckage was found 11 weeks later by a human survey vessel. There were no survivors. The Vorkai patrol had filed no report of the incident, which suggested they had not considered it worth filing. One human colony ship was not, in their calculation, a matter requiring paperwork. It was, however, a matter requiring a response. What followed was 6 years of war, and in those 6 years, almost every alien civilization watching from a safe distance agreed on one thing: humanity was going to lose. The math was simple. The Vorkai collective had been a spacefaring species for 3 centuries. Their ships were bigger, their weapons more advanced, their battle experience measured in generations. Humanity had been in space for less than 80 years. Their fleet was small, their technology was behind, and their territory was limited to a handful of systems that the Vorkai could have closed off with a quarter of their full military force. The first year of the war confirmed what everyone expected. Humanity lost engagements in open space. Vorkai warships were larger and could sustain fire longer. Human vessels took damage faster. Human supply lines were shorter and more easily disrupted. 3 human outposts were taken in the first 18 months, and 2 colony stations were damaged so badly they had to be evacuated. Military analysts from the Dravethi Union prepared a projected timeline for the end of the conflict. Their estimate was that humanity would either surrender or be reduced to a single defended home system within 4 years. They were wrong. What the analysts had not accounted for was something that showed up in battle records but was very difficult to quantify in a spreadsheet. Human crews did not behave the way other species behaved when a fight started going badly. Most species, when the calculations turned against them, began the rational process of disengagement. Retreat, regroup, negotiate. It was logical. It was how wars were managed so that both sides survived to reach an eventual settlement. Human crews did something different. When the fight got worse, they got quieter. They got focused. Engineers who should have been in protected zones moved out into damaged sections of ships to make repairs while the battle was still happening. Pilots flew patterns that should not have worked because they required the pilot to accept a higher personal risk in exchange for better coverage of the people around them. Commanders gave orders and their crews carried them out even when those orders meant going toward the danger instead of away from it. The Vorkai flagged this behavior in their own reports. Several Vorkai admirals used the same word in separate documents written thousands of kilometers apart. The word translated roughly as unnatural. They did not mean it as a compliment. By year 3, the Vorkai had stopped gaining ground. By year 4, they were losing it. Not because humanity suddenly built larger ships or better weapons. They did not. They won it the same way they had held on through a willingness to endure, to adapt, to keep going past the point where any reasonable calculation said, stop. The ceasefire came in year 6. The Vorkai did not call it a defeat. They called it a strategic restructuring. But the border lines that were drawn placed every contested system on the human side. Every outpost that had been taken was returned, and the Marigold system, where it had all begun, was designated human territory with a buffer zone extending 100,000 km beyond it in every direction. The galactic community watched all of this and came to a conclusion that felt reasonable to them at the time. Humans were stubborn and emotional and difficult to predict. They were not, however, a serious, long-term military power. Their fleet was still small. Their technology was still behind. Their economy was strong, but their military spending was not in the same range as the major powers. The general consensus was that humanity had gotten lucky and that luck would eventually run out. So no one paid much attention when, in the years after the ceasefire, human shipyard activity went quiet. There had always been a section of human military production that was registered with the Galactic Commerce Registry. Tonnage reports, construction schedules, crew assignment filings. It was standard practice for all spacefaring species to file these things, partly for trade transparency, and partly because it helped everyone know where everyone else stood. The Vorkai filed. The Drebethi filed. The Caliph filed. For a while humanity filed too. And then gradually they stopped. Not all at once. Not in a way that triggered any immediate alarm. It happened slowly across different categories spread out over years. First, the large construction schedules disappeared from public records. Then certain shipyard facility reports went dark. Then a whole class of vessel designation that human engineers had been testing, heavy platform design, long-range independent operation hull type, simply stopped appearing anywhere in any shared database. The Drevity Intelligence Office sent a query to the human government about the missing filings. The response they received was polite and thorough and explained that the relevant facilities had been restructured for domestic infrastructure purposes and that updated filings would be forthcoming. The updated filings never came. No one pushed the issue. Humanity was not considered a threat. They were considered a minor power with an impressive stubbornness rating and a useful frontier buffer zone. They were not worth the diplomatic friction of a formal demand. Lieutenant Kara Novik knew all of this history. She had studied it at the academy the way all young officers studied it as background, as context, as the story of how humanity found its place in a galaxy that had not expected them and did not fully know what to do with them. What she understood now, sitting at her station on the Ardent with 40 Vorka warships on her sensor screen, was that the history everyone else had read and decided they understood was only part of the story, the part that had been shown, the part that was meant to be seen. The other part had been built in silence, over 30 years in shipyards that filed no reports and produced no public records. It had been staffed by engineers who signed agreements that were not discussed in any public forum. It had been funded through budget lines that human financial disclosures described in language so general that no outside analyst had looked twice. 30 years of work, 30 years of quiet, and now somewhere in the dark behind the small human patrol fleet, the result of all that quiet was on its way. Kara looked at her sensor screen. She looked at the Vorkai fleet. She thought about all the analysts who had written their confident projections 40 years ago. She thought about the word that Vorkai admirals had used in their reports. Unnatural. She thought that maybe they had been right, just not in the way they meant it. There was something in humanity that did not accept the numbers when the numbers said give up, something that looked at the gap between what it had and what it needed and decided the answer was to close the gap instead of accept it. Something that could look at 30 years of quiet, patient work and not flinch, not rush, not announce itself early. Something that could wait. The sensor alert that came through 3 hours later was small. A mass reading at extreme range, barely above the noise threshold of the instruments. It was easy to miss. Most systems logged it as a calibration artifact. Kara did not miss it. She had been watching for it. She pulled the reading up on her secondary screen and looked at it for a long moment. Then she looked at Commander Dale Mercer, who was sitting in his command chair with his cold coffee, watching the Vorkai formation with calm gray eyes. He already knew. He had known since the message went out. Kara turned back to her screen and quietly began calculating the arrival time. She did the math twice to make sure she had it right. 3 hours, maybe a little less. She sat back in her chair and let out a slow, quiet breath. Outside, the Vorkai fleet held its position and waited for the small human fleet to do what small things always do when something much larger moves toward them. The humans did not move. Srakvas had been a fleet admiral for 22 years, and in that time he had faced down 3 separate species who had tried to challenge Vorkai authority in the frontier zones. All 3 of those challenges had ended the same way. The smaller force eventually moved. It always did. That was the nature of space and power, and the very simple truth that numbers did not lie. He looked at the sensor display showing the 16 human ships again and felt something close to impatience. They had been sitting there for nearly 90 minutes without moving, without responding to his last transmission, without doing anything that made any military sense. He had given them time. He had been almost generous about it, by his own measure. He had even allowed his crew to rest in shifts while they waited because he was confident the wait would not be long. The problem was that it was becoming long. His communications officer informed him that the monitoring vessels from both The Dravethi Union and the Caliph. Monarchy were still watching on. Long-range sensors. He already knew this. He had known it since the encounter began. And the longer the human fleet sat there, without retreating, the more that watching started to feel like a problem. It was not that he was worried about the humans. He was not. 16 ships, none of them larger than a heavy frigate, none of them carrying weapons that his fleet could not absorb and answer. In a straight fight, the outcome would take less than an hour and the result would not be in question. He knew this the way he knew his own name. What bothered him was the watching. The Dravethi and the Caliph were recording all of this. If the human simply sat there indefinitely and he did nothing, the record would show that the Vork Collective had brought 40 warships to confront 16, issued an ultimatum, and then waited. That was not a record he wanted filed in anyone's archives. He made his decision. He called his senior officers to the command bridge and told them they were moving forward. Not to fire, not yet, but to advance the fleet to close range and make the ultimatum physical. Let the humans look at 40 Vorkai warships from close enough to read the hull markings. Let their crews feel what it meant to be that small in the presence of something that large. Sometimes the lesson needed to be taught with proximity rather than words. His officers agreed. None of them saw any reason not to. The Vorkai fleet began to move. On the bridge of the UES Ardent, the sensor alert sounded before anyone spoke. Kara Novik was already looking at her screen when the movement registered. 40 Vorkai vessels, all of them adjusting course, all of them pointing their bows toward the human formation. Not at full speed. A controlled advance. A walk, not a run. But forward. Dale Mercer looked at the display for a moment. Then he opened the ship-wide channel. His voice was even and quiet. He told the crew that the Vorkai fleet was advancing and that all stations should move to readiness condition 2. He said that off-duty personnel should find a secure seat and that anyone not actively working a console should stay away from the outer hull sections. He said it the way someone might describe a change in the weather. Matter of fact. No edge, no alarm. He closed the channel. Ensign Pete Garland, who was running secondary navigation at the station beside Kara, looked at her with wide eyes. Pete was 23 years old and had been on his first frontier deployment for exactly 11 weeks. He was good at his job, but he had not yet developed the specific kind of calm that came from being in a bad situation and choosing to stay calm anyway. He was in the process of learning it right now, which was obvious from the way his hands had gone very still on his console. Kara looked at him and told him to keep watching the mass readings on the deep range instruments. She said to let her know the moment the number changed. He nodded and turned back to his screen. Across the sector, Yale Praz, the Dravethi ambassador on the monitoring vessel, was now composing a different kind of message. His earlier note had been about anticipated human withdrawal. This one was more careful. He wrote that the situation was developing in a way that required closer attention and that his government should be aware that the Vorkai had chosen to escalate rather than wait. He noted that the human fleet had not retreated. He noted that they were not retreating now either, even as 40 warships advanced toward them. He found himself adding a line to his message that he had not planned to write. He wrote that the human crew behavior was, in his observation, unusual. That was all he wrote. He could not find the right word for what he was actually thinking, which was that the humans seemed to know something that no one else did. The Kalic observers had stopped talking among themselves entirely. They were watching. The Vorkai fleet closed the distance steadily. Esrakvos watched the human formation on his screen with focused attention. Still no movement. Still no change in engine output. Still no attempt to spread the formation wider or tighten it for defense. The humans were just sitting there, arranged in the same neat rows they had been in when his fleet first arrived. He decided that it truly was stupidity and not bravery, that they simply did not understand what was coming toward them, that the human commanders on those small ships had no real experience with what a full Vorkai fleet advance actually meant. Up close, he was 30,000 km from the human formation when Pete Garland made a sound at his console. It was not a word. It was the kind of sound a person makes when they see something that does not match what their brain was expecting. Short, quiet, a little bit like a held breath being released by accident. Kara was at his station in 2 steps. She looked at his screen. The mass reading on the deep rain instruments had changed. It was not a small change. It was not the kind of number that suggested a ship or a group of ships, or anything her instruments had ever returned a reading for before. It was a number that her sensor system had flagged with a question mark, the way it flagged readings that fell outside its calibrated range. It was asking in the language of machines whether the human who was reading it could please confirm that this was real, because the system was not designed to process something this large. Kara confirmed it. She looked at the distance reading beside the mass number. The object was still far out, still at the edge of detection range. But it was moving, slowly, steadily, and in a very direct line toward the Kepler frontier. She turned to Dale and told him that Shepard was on sensors. He did not look up from his own screen. He told her good and asked her to put the reading on the main display. The number appeared on the main display. Every officer on the bridge looked at it. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then someone near the back of the bridge let out a long, slow breath, and someone else made a quiet sound that was not quite a laugh but was close to one kind of sound people make when something they have been hoping for a long time finally turns out to be real. Outside, the Vorkai fleet was still coming. Esrakbos had not yet looked at his deep range instruments. He was focused on the human formation ahead of him, watching for the turn, watching for the retreat he was certain was about to begin. He was still watching for it when the first of his sensor officers turned from a console with an expression that Esrakbos had never seen on any of his crew in 22 years. It was not fear exactly. It was something more like the look of a person who has just been told that the ground beneath them is not ground at all. The officer said very quietly that there was something behind the human fleet. Esrakbos told him to put it on the main screen. The reading appeared. Esrakbos looked at it. He looked at the mass number. He looked at the distance. He looked at the direction of travel. Then he told his sensor officer to check the calibration on the instruments. The officer checked. The calibration was fine. Srakbos looked at the number again. The advance of his fleet slowed, not because he had ordered it to slow, but because the officers managing the navigation consoles had all looked at the same screen at the same moment, and their hands had, without any instruction, become less certain. The dark behind the human fleet was no longer empty. It did not arrive like a weapon. That was the thing every observer would remember most clearly afterward, through all the reports and recordings and long discussions that followed. A weapon arrives fast. A weapon is meant to shock, to arrive before the target can think, before the mind can process what is happening. The thing that came out of the dark behind the human patrol fleet did not do any of that. It came slowly. It came the way a mountain would come if mountains could move. It came with a deep and complete confidence of something that does not need to hurry, because hurrying is for things that are afraid of being stopped. The UES Shepherd entered sensor resolution in stages. First, the mass reading that had appeared on the instruments grew larger and more detailed as the distance closed. Then the deep space radar of every ship in the area, human, Vorkai, Trebethi, and Caliph-alike, began to return a shape. The shape was wrong at first. The instruments could not put it together cleanly because the hole was too large for the standard imaging software to frame in a single picture. It kept trying to center on one section, then losing the rest. Then slowly the hole crossed the threshold where the human eye could pick it up on the visual feed. On the bridge of the Ardent, Kara Novik looked at the forward screen and felt something shift in her chest. She had been briefed. She had seen the schematics. She had studied the numbers in the construction reports and had thought she understood what the Shepherd would look like when it arrived. She had not understood. Knowing the numbers and seeing the thing were two entirely different experiences. The Shepherd was not shaped like a traditional warship. Warships were built narrow and pointed, designed to cut through space efficiently and present a small target. The Shepherd was built wide. It was built the way a city is built, outward in every direction, filling the available space, making no apology for the room it occupied. Its hull was dark gray and sectioned into massive plates that caught the distant starlight in flat, dull reflections. Along its sides, bay doors stretched for kilometers, each one large enough to release a full wing of smaller warships at once. At its front, a wide command superstructure sat elevated above the main hull like a tower above a plane. Its running lights were on, long lines of cold white that traced the edges of the hull and made the full shape legible against the black behind it. Those lights made it easier to see. That was exactly the point. The Shepherd was not hiding. It had never been hiding. On the Vorkai command ship, the bridge had gone completely quiet. Shrakva stood in front of the main display and looked at the visual feed with the kind of stillness that comes not from calm, but from a mind that is working very hard and very fast to reconcile what it is seeing with what it expected to see. His fleet had stopped its advance. No one had ordered the stop. It had simply happened the way all ships in a formation respond when the lead vessel slowed down, and the lead vessels had slowed because the officers at those navigation consoles were looking at the same screen as everyone else. One of his senior captains opened a channel and asked quietly whether Shrakvas had any information about that vessel. Shrakvas did not answer immediately. The shepherd was still closing the distance, still slow, still steady. Its engine signature was enormous, not violent, not aggressive, just large in the way that everything about it was large. The sensor readings for its power output were high enough that the Vorkai instruments had initially categorized them as a local stellar event before recalibrating. Yelpress, aboard the Drevethi monitoring vessel, had stopped writing his message to his government. He was sitting in his chair looking at the visual feed on his own screen, and the document he had been composing, the one about human withdrawal and territorial renegotiation, was still open on the display beside him. Unfinished. He looked at the word withdrawal and then looked at the shepherd and then slowly closed the document without saving it. The Calith research station had gone silent. 3 observers were standing in front of their main display, shoulder to shoulder, none of them speaking. One of them was recording the feed manually with a personal device because she wanted to make sure that if anything happened to the station's records, she would still have this. The shepherd crossed into the Kepler frontier and slowed further. It did not stop entirely. It settled into a position behind and above the human patrol fleet, close enough to be unmistakably connected to them, far enough that its bulk did not crowd the smaller ships. It sat there the way a wall sits, present, unmoving, needing no explanation for why it was there. On its bridge, Captain Lena Marsh looked at the tactical display and said nothing. For a moment, she was a woman in her mid-50s, with short silver hair and a manner that had always reminded the people who worked under her of a surgeon, precise, unhurried, focused entirely on what needed to be done and not at all on what was dramatic about the moment. She had been on the shepherd for 4 years. She had watched it be finished and fitted and tested. She had run drills in its corridors and sat through the long, quiet transit from the classified construction zone to the frontier staging position where the ship had waited for exactly this kind of moment. She had thought during those years of waiting about what it would feel like when the ship finally arrived somewhere that mattered. It felt like work. That was the honest answer. There was something to do, and she was there to do it. She told her communications officer to open a channel to the Vorkai fleet. She asked for the fleet admiral directly. There was a pause on the Vorkai end that lasted longer than such things usually lasted. Then Shrak Voss answered. Lena introduced herself by name and rank. She said that the human patrol fleet operating in the Kepler frontier was under her protection. She said that she had monitored the transmissions between the Vorkai fleet and the UES Ardent and that she wanted to address the situation directly and without any further delay. She said that she was prepared to discuss the terms of the Vorkai fleet's withdrawal from human territorial space at whatever time was convenient for the admiral. She did not say it as a threat. She said it as a scheduling matter. There was another long pause. Shrak Voss had commanded warships for 22 years. He had faced down challenges, absorbed losses, managed defeats, and turned situations around through a combination of experience and the kind of tactical instinct that only came from spending a Long time in the dark between stars. He was not by any measure a small man, or a small commander. He looked at the shepherd on his screen. He looked at the bay doors along its sides closed now, but each one large, enough to tell any observer what was behind it. He looked at the power readings. He looked at the mass. He looked at the command superstructure, at the front of the hull and at the cold, white running lights that traced every edge of that enormous shape. He thought about the laugh he had sent across the open frequency 3 hours ago. He thought about it the way a person thinks about something they said in a room full of people and cannot take back. When he spoke, his voice was level. He said that he would need to consult with his command structure before responding to the captain's offer. Lena said that was perfectly reasonable. She said she would be in the same position when he was ready. She closed the channel. Behind her, the bridge crew of the Shepherd continued doing their work, without any particular change in manner. Officers checked systems, reported readings, updated navigation logs. Someone near the back of the bridge said something quiet that made the person next to them almost smile. The ship hummed around them with the deep, settled sound of something very large operating exactly as it was designed to operate. On the Ardent, Dale Mercer was looking at the forward display where the Shepherd now filled a large portion of the visual field. He had seen the schematics too. He had known it was coming. But seeing it from the outside, from the bridge of a small frigate with the full scale of it laid out in front of him, was still something that took a moment to absorb. Beside him, Kara Novik was updating the sensor logs and tracking the Vorkai fleet's position. The 40 warships had not advanced any further. They were simply sitting where they had stopped, their engines idling the way group of people sit when they have walked into a room and found it arranged very differently than they expected. Kara noted the time in the log. She noted the Shepherd's arrival position. She noted that the Vorkai fleet had halted. Then she reached over to the small side console and picked up Dale's coffee cup. She looked at it. Stone cold. She went and got him a fresh one without being asked. The Vorkai fleet withdrew. The next morning, there was no battle. There was no fire exchanged, no damage taken, no lives lost on any side. The 40 warships that had arrived in the Kepler frontier with so much confidence turned slowly in the dark and moved back the way they had come, one by one and then in groups until the sensor screen on the Ardent showed nothing where they had been. Dale Mercer watched them go. He finished his second cup of coffee, which was still warm this time. He told Kara to log the withdrawal with full timestamps and to flag the encounter file for command review. She was already doing both. Srakovos filed no official report of the encounter for days. When the report finally appeared in the shared military registry, it described the contact as a routine patrol. Interaction resolved through diplomatic communication. It made no mention of the laughter broadcast across the open frequencies. It made no mention of the ultimatum. It did not include the recordings from his own ship's audio logs, though copies of those recordings were already circulating in intelligence networks across 6 different species, governments shared by the Dravethi and Caliph observers who had recorded everything from their monitoring positions. Nobody pointed out the missing information to the Vorkai officially. That was not how these things worked. The recording simply existed, passed from one intelligence file to another, studied in quiet offices by people whose job it was to understand power and how it moved through the galaxy. Those people were very busy in the weeks that followed. Captain Lena Marsh held meetings aboard the Shepherd. She held them in a conference room midway along the ship's main corridor, room that was simple and well lit and had a long table with enough chairs for a full delegation. She met with Vorkai representatives. First, then Dravethi, then Caliph. She met with 2 other species who had not been in the area during the encounter but had reached out through diplomatic channels once the news spread, which it did quickly, the way news always does when it changes something important. Every meeting followed the same pattern. The delegations arrived. They looked around the Shepherd on the way in because it was impossible not to. The corridors alone were wide enough to drive vehicles through. The ceilings were high. The ship moved around them with the deep hum of a power plant that did not strain at anything it was asked to do. The delegations walked through all of this to the conference room and sat down across the table from Lena and her team. Lena did not make speeches. She did not offer threats or demands. She was clear and simple and direct in the way that people are when they have something solid behind them and do not need to make noise about it. She said that humanity wanted its territorial boundaries respected. She said that human ships operating in designated human space were not to be challenged or threatened. She said that humanity wanted full and equal standing in any galactic forum where decisions affecting human territory or human people were made. She said that human vessels had the same right to transit any non-restricted space lane that vessels of any species had, and that this right was not subject to negotiation. She said all of this in a tone that was more like a conversation than a confrontation. At the end of each meeting, before the delegation left, she placed a single data card on the table. It was a small thing, no bigger than 2 fingers laid side by side. She told each delegation that the card contained the basic construction, specifications, and operational capacity of the Shepherd. She said it was offered as a courtesy so that there would be no uncertainty about what they were dealing with. She paused at that point each time in the same deliberate way, and then she said the same thing to each delegation in the same calm voice. She said there were 2 more like it. The meetings were short after that. The Dravethi ambassador, Yil Praz, sent a message to his government that was 11 pages long. He had started it before the meeting and finished it after. It was a thorough, careful document about the recalibration of the Dravethi Union's assessment of human military capacity, and it included a recommendation that the Union immediately begin reviewing every assumption it had made about humanity over the past 40 years. The message was classified at the highest level. It was nevertheless the most widely read document in the Dravethi government. For the next 3 months, the Caliph observers wrote their own report, which reached a similar conclusion by a different route. They focused heavily on the timeline, the 30 years of quiet construction, the missing shipyard records, the budget lines that had been listed under vague descriptions in human financial disclosures. They were less interested in the Shepherd itself than in what the Shepherd meant about human planning and human patience. Their report ended with a line that became somewhat famous in the intelligence community afterward. It said that the Caliph monarchy had been watching humanity for 40 years and had consistently mistaken silence for absence. On the Ardent, the days after the withdrawal were quiet. The patrol resumed its normal schedule. The ship moved along its assigned route, checking waypoints, logging readings, maintaining the kind of presence that patrol fleets maintained everywhere that borders needed to be watched. Kara Novik wrote a letter home. She sat at the small desk in her quarters during an off-shift hour and typed it out on her personal device, the way she always did when something happened that she wanted to remember clearly. She wrote to her younger brother, who was studying engineering at a university in Ohio and had been following the frontier deployment through news feeds. She told him that the encounter had ended without a shot being fired. She told him that nothing had burned, nobody had died, and that the patrol was continuing normally. She told him that it had been, in most visible ways, a very ordinary few days. She thought for a while about how to describe the rest of it. She wrote that sometimes the most powerful thing a person could do was not the loudest thing and not the fastest thing and not even the most obvious thing. Sometimes the most powerful thing was to work quietly for a very long time on something that mattered and then show up with it when the moment came and let it speak without needing any help. She wrote that she thought humanity had done that, not just out here, not just in this one encounter in one quiet corner of space, but as a whole across decades of careful and patient effort that most people had not noticed and most outside observers had not believed was happening. She wrote that she was proud, which surprised her a little because she was not usually a person who used that word easily. She sent the letter and went back to her station. Outside the Ardennes hole, the Kepler frontier was the same as it had always been. Cold, dark, stars scattered across the black in every direction, each one far away and old and indifferent to what happened between them. The shepherd sat in the frontier like a fixture, like something that had always been there and would be there for a long time to come. Its running lights traced its edges, long clean lines. Its bay doors stayed closed. Its engines ran at low power, enough to hold position, no more. Its thousands of crew members went through their days in corridors that stretched for kilometers, eating in the wide mess halls, sleeping in their bunks, working their stations, talking in the break rooms about ordinary things. No fleet came near the Kepler frontier after that, not for a long time. The galactic community did not make any formal announcement about the change in their understanding of humanity. That was not how these things were done. But in the intelligence files and the diplomatic memos and the quiet conversations between senior officers of every spacefaring species who had been paying attention, the recalibration was thorough and complete. Humanity had spent 40 years being underestimated. They had spent 40 years being called emotional, irrational, lucky, minor. They had spent 40 years filing the paperwork that needed to be filed and not filing the paperwork that did not, and building in the silence that no one watched closely because no one thought they were worth watching closely. And now the math was different. In the galaxy, where power was measured and recorded and adjusted for constantly, math was the one thing that did not care about history or assumptions or how confident someone had been before the numbers changed. The numbers had changed. The frontier held. And somewhere in the deep dark behind 16 small ships that had not moved an inch, when 40 warships advanced on them, the Shepherd kept its lights on, steady and quiet and very, very large.